I remember that afternoon as though it had been stitched into the very fabric of Oxford itself. The kind of day when the autumn light falls obliquely across the quads, gilding the worn stone with a gentle, reluctant warmth. I walked slowly, my coat pulled tight against a wind that carried a hint of early frost, and listened to the faint echo of chapel bells that had struck the hour just before I set foot on the cobbles. There was an almost imperceptible dampness in the air, not the wetness of rain, but the soft decay of fallen leaves, curling and brown, scattered beneath the elms whose branches reached across the quadrangle like the fingers of a careful but distracted hand. The quads were quiet, almost deserted, as if the college itself had paused to catch its breath, and I felt a curious mixture of relief and unease at being alone with the long shadows of its arches. I was aware, without thinking, of the peculiar hum of distant conversation that drifted from one of the colleges, a low murmur punctuated by occasional laughter. It was in that half-heard rhythm that I first encountered the news of a death during high table, a whispered report carried by an idle porter who glanced at me with an expression of both curiosity and caution. The details were scant and indirect: an esteemed botanist, a sudden collapse, no sign of violence, an otherwise ordinary evening transformed into a quiet tragedy. I found myself noting the inconsistencies even as I listened, a slip of the tongue here, a hesitation there. A man does not simply fall at a high table without leaving some echo of himself behind. The hall itself, when I passed its heavy doors later, had already closed to the afternoon light, the interior dim and resonant with polished oak. Chairs stood slightly askew, as though some minor disturbance had preceded the final arrangement, and the lingering scent of wine and candle wax hung faintly in the shadows. There were signs, too, of papers left open, a page turned and then abandoned, as if the deceased had been interrupted mid-thought. My attention lingered on these small anomalies, the subtle disorder, the faint impression that something had not gone according to plan. Even the careful arrangement of the silver and the glassware betrayed a tiny contradiction in order, a minor detail that would not have caught the eye of the casual observer, but did not escape mine. Later, as I passed the library steps, I could see the late afternoon sun striking the tops of the shelves, sending shafts of light into corners, dusted with memory and the scent of old paper. There was something melancholic in the quiet, the weight of scholarly pursuit mingled with the inevitable decay of both human life and ambition. I paused to notice the angle of a fallen leaf on the stone, the shadow it cast against the worn floor, and thought briefly of how easily a moment can become evidence if one only looks closely enough. Even then, without any overt crime scene to inspect, I sensed that the ordinary had become deceptive. It was in these quiet contemplative hours, wandering among the ancient stones and listening to the rhythm of Oxford life, that I first began to assemble fragments in my mind, a misquoted Latin phrase recalled in passing, a name pronounced with too much emphasis, the subtle tilt of a glass left on the table. Each piece, almost imperceptible, would later matter, and I felt the first stirrings of that peculiar tension that accompanies the knowledge of a human life ended in what should have been a place of decorum and routine. That is how the case announced itself to me, not with a bang, nor with clamour, but with the soft, golden melancholy of autumn light in Christ Church. It was late in the afternoon when the note arrived, slipped under the door with the silence of a whispered confession. I found it resting on the threshold, a small cream-coloured square of paper, the handwriting deliberate and unadorned. The words were few, almost elliptical, but they carried the weight of intention truth hides in the wine and the words spoken lightly. I read it twice, slowly, allowing each letter to echo in my mind, and even as I turned it over there was no signature, no hint of provenance beyond the subtle pressure of the pen that traced the curves of each character. There was a peculiar charm in its restraint, as though the sender sought to provoke thought rather than fear. I tucked it into my notebook and allowed the quiet urgency to settle over me. Later, I reviewed the hall register for the evening in question. There were discrepancies, not large enough to alarm, but enough to pique my attention. A visiting fellow listed in one column but absent in another, a name crossed out with indecisive ink. The minutiae of attendance had always fascinated me. One could discern temperament and character in the manner a man inscribed his signature or lingered over a column. Lewis's voice intruded via a brief telephone call, noting that a witness claimed to have seen the botanist more cheerful than usual just before dinner. The contradiction pricked my mind like the first chill of winter. How one moment of demeanour could mask intent or conceal a deeper agitation remained a puzzle I had not yet solved. I found myself recalling the subtleties overheard among the servants, the casual remark about a debate over the new endowment, the whisper concerning a minor disagreement in botanical nomenclature. I had learned to trust these fragments. They carried the resonance of truth that the more decorous accounts often lacked. Even as I moved through the quiet quads, I replayed the lines of the note in my mind, juxtaposing them against the discrepancies in the register. There was a pattern forming, though indistinct, like the first notes of a theme in an unfinished sonata. The wine had been mentioned once, casually, in a conversation with a porter who had served that evening. Not the quality or vintage, merely the placement of glasses, the order of serving, and the minor tremor in her hand as a decanter passed from host to guest. I filed this observation alongside the subtle oddity of the misquoted Latin proverb murmured at the table, and the way one guest's posture stiffened when questioned about the botanist's recent publications. Each moment seemed trivial, yet together they hummed with the potential for revelation if one only had the patience to discern the rhythm beneath the surface. By evening, I had settled with a cup of tea beside the window, the fading light catching the edges of my notebook and casting elongated shadows across the page. The note remained tucked inside, a constant reminder that information rarely arrives packaged in clarity. It is often concealed in suggestion, in the hesitation of speech, in the small spaces between words, and in the minutiae of ordinary routine. I traced my thoughts over the sequence of events, returning again to those single-phrase words spoken lightly. How many were careless, and how many carried the careful weight of design? In the quiet that settled over my flat, I felt the familiar ache of anticipation mingled with the melancholy of insight not yet fully grasped. There was a tension in the air, not of imminent danger, but of the understated precision with which human motives are concealed, and somewhere, hidden among the polite gestures and scholarly decorum of the high table, a truth waited, patient and unobtrusive, for recognition. I could not yet name it, nor feel its edges with certainty, but the note had drawn my attention toward it, and I knew that this subtle nudge, this whisper from an unseen hand, might yet guide me closer to the unspoken reality of the death that had quietly punctuated an otherwise ordinary evening. I first saw the body in a narrow corridor just beyond the hall, the flickering lamplight catching the silver of spectacles slightly askew, and the unnatural slack of hands folded across the chest. It was not the sight itself that unsettled me, though there was a quiet sadness in the stillness, but the arrangement of minutiae, the delicate fold of a cuff, the tilt of a chair nearby, a single leaf pressed against the marble floor as though it had been deliberately placed. The deceased, a man of meticulous habit and quiet erudition, had devoted his life to the classification of plants, and I noted almost automatically the irony of his precise arrangements ending in this disarray. There was no sign of struggle, no sudden upheaval beyond the accidental disorder of the final moments, yet something in the atmosphere whispered of human interference. I spoke briefly with the porter, who was reluctant to dwell on the details, offering only what was necessary. The botanist had seemed entirely untroubled at dinner, had conversed with a select few, and had requested a particular glass of wine, which he had barely touched. Yet, even as the man spoke, his eyes flickered toward a painting on the corridor wall, a small detail he evidently had not intended to reveal. I made a note, recognizing the subtle tremor in voice and hand, the minor betrayal of conscience that often precedes a more significant revelation. Observations of this kind, insignificant to most, often provide the first hints of concealed intent. I examined the glassware left on the table, noting a faint residue along the rim, inconspicuous but present, suggesting either neglect or design. Nearby, a botanical illustration lay open, its edges curling slightly from the heat of the lamps, and a faint smudge of ink marred an otherwise immaculate page. It was tempting to dismiss such things, yet years of experience had taught me that trifles often conceal motives. The deceased had been involved in a recent dispute over a rare species acquisition, a quarrel among colleagues, though the depth of rancor was difficult to gauge. Even the most cultured disputes carry undertones that only close observation can reveal. The visiting fellow who had seated himself next to the botanist at the high table exhibited an almost imperceptible stiffness, a hesitation when I queried the sequence of events. He spoke as if recounting someone else's actions, his gaze darting to the floor. There was a casual remark about a poisoned mind, delivered lightly, almost as a jest, yet I filed it away. One cannot ignore the possibility that humor is sometimes a mask for truth. I traced my finger along the polished surface of the hall table, noting the residual warmth of a decanter recently handled, and I considered how these minute elements might align with motive and opportunity. Later, walking through the empty quads, I recalled the interactions at dinner, the subtle eye contact, the casual distancing of one guest from another, the faint odor of a particular perfume lingering longer than propriety dictated. Each of these, when strung together, formed a tapestry more revealing than any singular statement. The botanist had been both admired and envied, and admiration often carries its shadow, as I had learned over many cases and long hours of solitary reflection. I could sense, even before reviewing notes or consulting Lewis, that this death was not entirely the result of misfortune. In the quiet of my flat that evening, I revisited the observations. The smudge on the illustration, the minor discrepancy in the seating order, the residue on the rim of the glass. Slowly, patterns emerged, not the full truth, but the flicker of understanding that signals the beginning of insight. Somewhere amid these details, and perhaps hidden within the understated elegance of the college's routines, lay the key to unraveling a death that seemed at first to belong solely to chance. As with all things in Oxford, the ordinary conceals the extraordinary, and one must watch with patience and a keen eye to perceive what lies just beyond the threshold of perception. I wandered once more through the hall, now emptied of the bustle that had marked the dinner, and my gaze fell upon the portraits lining the walls. They were of men long past, eyes set with the quiet authority that centuries of expectation afford, their expressions a careful balance of severity and benevolence. There is a peculiar intimacy in these painted faces, a sense that the observer is being watched in return. I noted how one particular portrait, a founder with sharply angled features, seemed almost to follow my movements, a subtle psychological trick, yet it lodged in my mind with more insistence than I expected. It was as though the hall itself had preserved a memory of observation, one that outlasted the subjects themselves. The deceased botanist had been well acquainted with the college's history, and I recalled conversations where he had mentioned the arrangement of these very portraits, the lineage they represented, and the subtle rivalries encoded in their placement. It struck me now that the room, serene as it appeared, bore traces of those same tensions. The whispers of precedence and favour were embedded in the way chairs had been set, the quiet shifts of foot traffic along the oak floor, even in the measured cadence of conversation, which I had overheard in fragments. One must read these silences as carefully as the spoken word, for they often convey more than a polite narrative can. I spoke with a fellow don, a woman of considerable intellect, whose demeanour was both inviting and cautious. She recounted the sequence of dinner conversation, noting who had leaned toward whom, who had smiled faintly at the expense of another, and who had refrained from speaking entirely. Her recollections were precise, almost mechanical, yet I sensed in her tone an undercurrent of suppressed emotion, subtle irritation perhaps, or the polite concealment of judgment. It was these small hesitations, these carefully chosen omissions, that began to form the outline of motive and opportunity. A detail that seemed almost trivial struck me as the deceased had been particularly attentive to a painting opposite the high table, a depiction of the college garden in early spring. He had lingered over its brushwork, remarking on the precision of foliage, the alignment of shadows, as if searching for some hidden order. I noted that the visiting fellow who had sat beside him at dinner had scarcely glanced at it, his eyes, instead, flitting across the hall in a restless pattern. The contrast was telling, a subtle indication of temperament and preoccupation that may have mattered far more than a casual observer would suppose. The arrangement of the portraits, their lineage and gaze, combined with these human gestures, suggested a hierarchy not only of blood and office, but of intellectual ambition and quiet envy. Even the hall itself seemed to have absorbed these emotions, the polished oak reflecting more than light, the shadows preserving the weight of unspoken truths. I traced my finger along the edge of a frame, noting a small nick in the wood, hardly perceptible. Yet it served as a metaphor, perhaps, for the imperfection underlying the studied composure of those present at dinner. As I left the hall, stepping over the threshold into the fading afternoon, I was aware that the portraits had not merely observed the past, but continued to participate in the subtle choreography of human desire, pride, and rivalry. And somewhere within that intricate network, the truth of the botanist's death rested quietly, awaiting recognition. I could not yet name it, nor fully discern its shape, but the interplay of gazes, silences, and gestures had begun to sketch its outline. Oxford had, as always, provided its clues with elegance and discretion, and I was compelled to follow their faint but persistent whisper toward understanding. I had returned to my flat by the time the evening settled fully into Oxford, the sky muted with a melancholy dusk that pressed against the window panes. The city had grown quieter, the footsteps along the cobbles slower, as though the day itself had tired of motion and conversation. I poured a measure of whisky into a glass, not with anticipation of dulling thought, but to sharpen the edges of perception, and sat with the local newspaper before me. My attention fell upon the crossword, a familiar distraction and, more often than not, an instrument of subtle insight. I paused at a clue that read, "Venomous scholar misquoted, 7 letters," and something in the phrasing resonated with a conversation I had overheard at a high table. The clue felt almost personal, as if it had been crafted to illuminate the shadows I had already begun to trace. I considered the sequence of guests at the dinner, recalling the botanist's gentle insistence on precision, the visiting fellow's restless posture, the subtle tremor in the hand of a junior don when questioned about the discussion of rare species. Each recollection struck me anew as I aligned it against the cryptic suggestion of the crossword. There was a rhythm here, a deliberate tension between what was spoken and what was left unspoken. Crossword clues, I reflected, are not unlike human gestures. The overt message is often a misdirection, the truth embedded in subtle patterns and overlooked angles. I traced the letters in the answer space, feeling the whisper of recognition, though the solution remained just out of reach. Lewis had called earlier, asking if I had yet gleaned anything useful from the witnesses. I recalled my reply not yet, but the way one man had hesitated over a comment regarding botanical classifications suggested more than professional interest. I had filed that detail with the precision of a librarian cataloguing a particularly troublesome manuscript, aware that such minutiae would later reveal their significance. The crossword clue, in its own understated fashion, had done the same. It hinted at inversion, subtle deception, the misalignment of expectation and reality. I rose to pace the room, allowing the whiskey's heat to counter the chill that had crept in through the window. My mind wandered to the half-glimpsed gestures at the high table, the faintly perfumed air, the uneven arrangement of chairs, the leaf that had fallen upon the hall floor, overlooked yet now insistent in memory. Patterns began to emerge, delicate and unspoken, between the alignment of guests, the distribution of wine, and the minor dissonances in conversation. Each was a note in a complex score, and the crossword had provided the first intimation of its theme misquotation, a slippage of precision, the hidden echo behind a polite facade. I revisited my notebook, comparing the faint residue on the glass rim with the sequence of events as recalled by the porter and the hall staff. A minor contradiction struck me anew, subtle in tone but significant. The botanist had requested a particular wine, yet scarcely tasted it. Was this oversight, or an intentional gesture unnoticed by others? I scribbled the observation, aware that even small deviations from routine carry meaning when placed under the lens of careful attention. By the time the light had faded entirely, leaving the room in a hush of shadows and amber lamplight, I felt the first tangible stirrings of comprehension. The crossword, trivial on the surface, had lent structure to the chaos of observation, illuminating connections that had previously escaped notice. I set the newspaper aside, the whiskey glass reflecting a muted gleam, and allowed the patterns to consolidate in silence. Somewhere amid these faint echoes, the unspoken tensions of the high table and the gestures of those present lay the key to understanding what had caused a man of such meticulous habit to end so quietly, so suddenly. The insight had yet to coalesce fully, but the first threads were drawn taut, promising the unravelling of truth in due course. The library was nearly deserted when I arrived, the late afternoon sun slipping between tall, mullioned windows and casting long, trembling shadows across shelves lined with leather-bound tomes. The scent of old paper and wax polish lingered, mingling with the faint trace of damp from the quads beyond, and I moved slowly, allowing the quiet to settle over me like a familiar cloak. There is a peculiar intimacy in libraries, a sense that every whispered footfall carries the weight of history and expectation. I noted the creak of floorboards as I passed, the gentle swish of a page turned elsewhere, and felt the subtle tension that always accompanies spaces filled with human thought preserved in silence. I sought out the journals of the botanist, curious about what traces he might have left behind. The margins were neat, precise, each notation deliberate, yet a careful eye revealed anomalies, a line smudged, a date corrected, a Latin quotation underlined twice, almost as if to insist upon its importance. One poem tucked between pages of dry observations caught my attention. It spoke of hidden roots and secret blooms, a metaphor perhaps, or simply a whimsical flourish. Yet the placement, the intensity of the underlining, suggested an urgency that was anything but casual. I turned it over in my mind, aware that clues often hide in the spaces between lines, in the choices of emphasis, rather than in the words themselves. A professor appeared from the shadows between stacks, his manner hesitant yet not unfriendly. He spoke of minor disagreements over nomenclature, small disputes that seemed insignificant to the casual observer, but carried the weight of pride among scholars. His voice faltered when he mentioned a late-night conversation with the botanist, the detail of which he offered reluctantly, as though revealing it might betray something unspoken. I noted the slight frown, the tilt of the head, the careful avoidance of certain phrases, and recognized that his reticence might conceal more than it revealed. Such observations, trivial as they seemed, often formed the first threads of a larger tapestry. I lingered near the journal, recalling fragments of the evening, the careful placement of a decanter, the unremarkable yet precise way the botanist had arranged his notes on the table. Each subtle act, each slight hesitation in a guest's recounting of events, gained new significance in light of the patterns emerging from the pages before me. A misalignment in shelving, a smudge on a margin, the half-hidden line of a poem all hinted at the concealed rhythm of intent. The ordinary had begun to speak, murmuring truths in a whisper, demanding attention from those willing to read between the lines. A faint detail pricked my awareness. A letter found within the journal, folded several times, addressed to no one in particular. Its edges bore the wear of repeated handling, the ink slightly smudged as though pressed hastily against the page. I recalled the gesture at the high table, the way one guest had hesitated before responding to a simple question, and a connection flickered in my mind. There was a cadence to human behavior, a symmetry, even in misdirection, that often revealed itself only after the observer allowed the silence to deepen. The library, with its shadows and echoes, had provided that quiet space for perception to sharpen. I left the room with the journals tucked carefully under my arm, the light fading to amber, and the quiet ache of anticipation trailing behind me. Somewhere in those margins, in the delicate smudges and underlined lines, lay the whisper of the truth, waiting to be discerned. Oxford's libraries are patient observers. They watch, they guard, and they reveal only to those willing to attend to the shadowed spaces where the ordinary conceals the extraordinary. I returned to the hall the following morning, the light pale and hesitant, filtering through the tall windows in a way that seemed to render the space both familiar and subtly strange. The debris of the previous evening remained: a chair slightly askew, a page from a botanical manuscript lying at the edge of the table, its text partially obscured by a shadow. My attention was drawn to a missing page from the manuscript itself, an absence more noticeable for its silence than any outward sign of disturbance. The disappearance was curious, yet the college staff appeared unconcerned, noting only that manuscripts often suffer from wear or misplacement. But I had learned long ago that misplacement in Oxford often carries intention as well as accident. I examined the remaining pages, noting corrections and annotations in a meticulous hand. One passage, regarding a rare specimen, had been crossed out and rewritten several times. The repetition suggested more than scholarly fastidiousness. It implied an effort to disguise or redirect understanding. As I traced the flow of ink across the page, I recalled the gestures of the dinner guests, the subtle glance, the slight stiffening of posture, the half-spoken remark that slipped past, as if accidentally revealed. Each behavior now seemed to echo the uncertainties left on the manuscript's margins. There was a rhythm here, a hidden pattern, that required careful attention to discern. A package had arrived days before the death, delivered anonymously, and while its contents were of little apparent consequence, a bound journal, a few pressed flowers, it bore a discreet trace of significance. The wrapping paper had a slight imperfection along its edge, a faint smudge of ink that suggested hurried handling or deliberate concealment. I had filed it among my observations, suspecting that what seemed trivial might later emerge as decisive. In Oxford, as in life, the ordinary often conceals the extraordinary. A slight deviation from routine can be as revealing as a confession. I turned over the package in my hands, noting its weight, its texture, and the faint scent of wax, and tried to imagine who might have delivered it and why. The visiting fellow who had seated himself beside the botanist at the high table struck me again, not in his words, but in the pauses between them. He spoke politely, measuredly, yet there was a hesitation, a pause that lingered longer than propriety allowed. It reminded me of a crossword clue, the way the answer's letters must fit precisely, though the surface meaning misleads. Small discrepancies like these often mark the boundary between truth and obfuscation, and I noted them meticulously. Later, the same fellow denied any knowledge of the missing page, but I sensed, in the carefully neutral tone, a quiet, almost imperceptible deflection. It was enough to suggest that misdirection rather than innocence was at play. I paused to consider the broader implications. 2 red herrings had already emerged in my examination, one concerning a minor dispute over botanical credit, the other relating to a scholarship argument among scholars. Each provided intellectual satisfaction, yet neither aligned with the emerging constellation of subtle clues, the missing page, the misquoted Latin, the faint residue on the glass. My reflection was interrupted only by the faint creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind along the corridors, and the distant toll of chapel bells. Oxford is generous with its quiet cues. They often speak louder than words, provided one listens carefully. By evening, I had traced the sequence of manuscripts, gestures, and half-spoken remarks in my notebook. The misleading testament of the missing page, the anonymous package, and the carefully crafted behaviours of the guests formed a lattice of suggestion. None of it yet provided resolution, but it had begun to illuminate the underlying architecture of events. The ordinary had concealed, and now the concealed was beginning to assert itself. As always in Oxford, clarity would emerge slowly through observation and reflection, and not a moment too soon. It was a photograph that first drew me back to a shadowed corner of memory, a sepia-toned relic of a summer long past, tucked into the pages of a ledger I had almost overlooked. The botanist stood alongside another scholar, now long retired, their smiles precise, the kind cultivated for the camera, yet carrying an undercurrent of unspoken understanding. I studied the faces, the tilt of heads, the subtle distances maintained between them, and sensed the weight of grievances, rivalries, and perhaps fleeting camaraderie that lingered beneath the surface. Time had not erased these dynamics, only rendered them more obscure, like a painting fading under sunlight, and I felt the familiar ache of anticipation that accompanies the first flicker of recognition. I recalled conversations from a high table, fragments of dialogue, and gestures now imbued with significance. The botanist had occasionally remarked on past collaborations and subtle betrayals, his tone light but edged with something I had not yet discerned. The retired scholar had been mentioned in passing, a quiet figure whose absence now seemed pointed, almost like a ghost whose presence continued to shape events. The photograph, unremarkable to an untrained eye, carried a resonance that suggested motives buried beneath courtesy and academic propriety, motives that had quietly persisted, unchecked, over the years. Walking along the hall, I noted the arrangement of chairs, the faint residual scent of wine, and the careful alignment of manuscripts. Such details, trivial in isolation, acquired new significance against the backdrop of history and memory. The retired scholar, now merely a name and a fading visage, had once intersected profoundly with the botanist's life, and that intersection was beginning to echo in the present. I considered the subtle discrepancies in witness recollections of who had arrived first, who had spoken most, who had allowed a pause to stretch beyond politeness. Each hesitation, each carefully measured gesture, gained meaning when viewed in the context of enduring unspoken rivalries. There was, too, the matter of a misremembered phrase, a quotation slightly altered in a lecture years before, recalled by a witness with certainty but recorded differently in archival notes. I traced the discrepancy, aware that misquotation can signal more than error. It can conceal pride, resentment, or deflection. The mind preserves both truth and artifice, and discerning the line between the two requires patient observation. I considered how this small alteration might connect to the late botanist's demise, and I allowed the thought to linger, unforced, like a faint echo in a cathedral. The afternoon light dimmed as I examined the photograph again, noting the subtle interaction between figures, a hand resting lightly upon a desk, a gaze diverted toward an unseen object, a smile that did not quite reach the eyes. These minor details, when combined with the gestures and expressions I had observed at the hall, suggested a network of motives and tensions that extended far beyond the immediacy of the dinner. There was an enduring architecture of relationships, one constructed of memory, envy, and fleeting kindness, and it was in this structure that I sensed the contours of explanation. Returning to my flat, I allowed the photograph to rest upon my desk beside the journals and notes, a ghostly witness to both past and present. The quiet ache of recognition settled over me, a reminder that the past is never fully absent, only waiting to assert itself in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. In Oxford, history persists in the gestures of the living, the arrangement of objects, and the shadows that linger in familiar corridors. Somewhere, within this careful weave of memory and observation, lay the hint of the truth, waiting for patient attention and the faint illumination of insight to reveal it. It was a minor detail that first suggested itself as proof, almost too delicate to command attention. A leaf, pressed slightly beneath the weight of a chair leg in the hall, curling in a pattern that caught the fading light. Alone, it might have seemed inconsequential, an incidental touch of nature within the ordered geometry of the college. Yet when considered alongside the careful arrangement of glassware, the residual smudge on the manuscript, and the hesitations in conversation I had observed, it began to resonate. Proof, in Oxford as in life, is often ephemeral, visible only to those who notice its transient positioning, and I felt that first subtle flicker of understanding that hinted at design rather than accident. I retraced the movements of the evening in my mind, noting each gesture, each glance, each subtle deviation from expectation. The botanist's final interactions had been deliberate in their economy. He spoke little, yet left behind a lattice of suggestions embedded in the positions of objects and the orientation of conversation. I recalled the visiting fellow's slight hesitation when asked about the sequence of service, the junius, Don's too firm handling of a manuscript, and the faint smell of wine that lingered unusually near one guest. These elements, trivial when considered singly, began to align like constellations in the dark, forming a network of significance that only patient attention could illuminate. There was also the poem tucked into the margins of the botanist's journal, which I had overlooked earlier. Its lines had seemed whimsical, almost decorative, until I reconsidered the of words, the particular emphasis on certain letters and syllables, and the subtle repetition of a botanical term in each stanza. It was as if a cipher had been embedded within the verse, a quiet signal awaiting recognition. The ephemeral proof was never loud. It resides in suggestion, in the space between intention and observation, and one must attend with care to perceive it. I examined the alignment of chairs in the hall once more, noting that one had been moved imperceptibly, its orientation suggesting a conversation that had taken place not at the table, but at its periphery. I could reconstruct the sequence almost as if following a score, the minor deviations functioning as notes in a composition. Each observation hinted at motive, each misalignment offered a clue to the orchestration of events. Even the faint fingerprint of wax upon the table suggested a presence overlooked by others, yet captured by careful attention. Later, in the quiet of my flat, I reviewed my notes, allowing the faint impression of the evening to consolidate into a mental map. The ephemeral proof, this confluence of leaf, glass, manuscript, and gesture, demanded recognition, but it was delicate, requiring patience and reflection. I realized that the pattern, though subtle, contained within it a coherence that might guide the investigation forward. The ordinary, when carefully attended to, reveals its extraordinary nature, but only to those willing to read the quiet cues. As night settled over Oxford, the quads empty and the bells echoing faintly in the distance, I felt the familiar ache of partial comprehension. The ephemeral proof had illuminated a path, though not yet the entire journey. I was aware that the remaining pieces wards misquoted, gestures half-perceived, packages delivered and forgotten would need to align before certainty could be claimed. Yet even in this provisional insight there was satisfaction, the delicate recognition that the universe of human behavior leaves traces, however faint, and that attending to them is both responsibility and privilege. Shadows lengthened across my desk as I set the journals aside, knowing that attention and patience would, in time, reveal the hidden architecture of that fatal evening. I arranged for the principal guests to meet in the hall once more, under the pretense of informal discussion, though the true purpose was far subtler observation and quiet revelation. The hall was dimly lit. The afternoon sunlight filtered through tall, mullioned windows, casting elongated shadows along the polished floor. Chairs were positioned with deliberate irregularity, allowing me to note the natural inclinations of each participant. The atmosphere was calm yet charged, as if the room itself understood the significance of what was about to unfold. My attention lingered on the small details, a hand brushing against the polished oak, the faint scent of cologne, the slight misalignment of a notebook on the table. Such things, seemingly trivial, would provide the cues necessary to illuminate motive and opportunity. The first to speak was careful, measured, offering recollections of the dinner that seemed rehearsed, yet contained subtle cracks. I listened, noting pauses, inflections, and the soft insistence of certain words. One phrase in particular, the botanical term repeated oddly, almost insistently, caught my attention. It was reminiscent of the line in the journal I had examined, and its repetition here, unconsciously perhaps, signaled alignment with intent rather than chance. Each guest's posture and gesture revealed as much as their words the angle of a head, the subtle folding of hands, the way eyes lingered on a particular manuscript. These observations, when woven together, began to form a coherent tapestry, faint threads of meaning emerging from the ordinary. I drew attention, gently, to the discrepancies noted in previous conversations, asking for clarification in a manner that revealed nothing of my own interpretation. The visiting fellow's eyes flickered briefly, a subtle indication of unease, while another, more senior, maintained a polite but defensive composure. I allowed the silence to stretch, permitting observation to gain strength, and then casually referenced the missing manuscript page and the slightly smudged ink on the journal. The reactions were instantaneous yet understated, a flicker of recognition, a hesitation in speech, a hand moving minutely to cover a gesture. In these quiet signs, the architecture of truth began to reveal itself. The ephemeral proofs I had noted, the leaf pressed beneath the chair, the alignment of glassware, the minor smudges in the manuscript, coalesced in my mind. They indicated sequence, timing, and attention, allowing reconstruction of the final movements of the evening. The botanist's interactions, his careful placement of objects, his choice of words, all pointed toward an encounter designed with subtle precision. It became clear that a combination of envy, pride, and a concealed grievance had intersected at the high table, leading to the botanist's sudden collapse. There was no theatrical confession, no melodrama. The truth was elegant in its quiet inevitability. As I outlined the sequence, I observed the guests carefully. One of them, previously inconspicuous, had provided the last link, a minor contradiction in the recounting of the placement of manuscripts, subtle enough to be dismissed by casual attention, but significant in the alignment of gestures and timing. I confirmed my suspicions without direct accusation, allowing the truth to present itself through observation, the unspoken acknowledgement of those present. The resolution was less an unveiling than a recognition, an acceptance of the orchestration hidden within decorum and habit. When the discussion concluded, I allowed a pause before dismissing the group, noting the quiet relief and lingering tension alike. Oxford's light had shifted, casting long shadows across the hall, and I reflected on the interplay of ambition, pride, and human frailty that had produced the fatal evening. The high table, for all its grandeur and ceremony, had concealed a microcosm of human motivation, now revealed with subtle precision. I left the hall with the satisfaction tempered by melancholy, aware that the lesson of observation and patience had been reinforced once more, quietly, elegantly, and without excess.